Hi everyone, welcome to the Wax Daddy channel. I am Kevin, lover and collector of soundtracks on vinyl, film, and novelizations of the horror genre. Thanks for joining me for Movie Tie-In Massacre, where I'll be reviewing horror novelizations based off of their silver screen counterparts and delivering you, my readers, score. So let's go ahead and get started and see who survives by the last drop. Back in the 70s and 80s, book publishers were commissioned by movie studios to write novelizations for their films, most notably of the horror genre. Often referred to as movie tie-ins, this unsung subgenre of highly collectible books gave readers additional plot details, character development, and maybe some expansion to the lore that we thought that we already knew from the films. When I was a teen in the 90s, I learned about the existence of many of these horror novelizations through an old networking system called the interlibrary loan, where essentially you submitted a request to borrow a book from another library that your library did not have. Today we're looking at Friday the 13th, written by Victor Miller for the Sean Cunningham directed film of 1980. Expanded for novelization by Simon Hawke through paperback publisher Signet in 1987. Let's take a look at the book's mass market paperback price, which reads here as $2.95. So all we really need to do is just take that decimal, move it over to the right about 2 spaces, and now you've got your current value. It's 1958 in Camp Crystal Lake, and we meet Barry and Claudette, who are silently undressing each other with their eyes over campfire songs with their friends, and this ultimately leads to their less than inconspicuous exit. Just as they get hot and heavy in the barn, an unseen figure moves in and slashes them to pieces with a hunting knife. Right off the bat, we've taken out the OG counselor, setting off the deadly legacy of Camp Crystal Lake. Meanwhile, in 1980, Annie Phillips is hitchhiking her way into Camp Crystal Lake for a cook's position over at the camp. She astonishes locals when asking for a lift and catches it being referred to as Camp Blood, further corroborated by crazy person Ralph. Truck driver Ennis is kind enough to give her a lift, giving her some serious tea on Camp Blood before dropping her off at the halfway point. Annie successfully hitches the attention of a passing Jeep, hoping to ride out the last few miles to the camp. Up until this point, we've had no description of the killer's appearance or sex whatsoever. Annie quickly realizes that she's being held against her will and begs the unidentified driver to stop. Before flinging herself out of a moving Jeep at 60 miles per hour, the book reads, "Now the driver looked. Annie panicked at the expression of utter loathing and cold fury in those eyes." The chase through the woods leading to her death is straight from the script, as the page is quite short. This makes me appreciate the scene in the film much more, largely thanks to the tension of composer Harry Manfredini's amazing score. Just up the road from Annie's dying body are Ned, Jack, and Marcy, who are trucking on their way to camp as well. Upon arrival, they come face to face with owner Steve Christie, who immediately puts them to work and starts giving off weird, creepy vibes. Later on, we get a contextual flashback to fill in the gaps about last night between Steve and Alice. This scene showcases her concerns about Steve's stresses regarding trying to reverse his family's misfortune over the cursed camp. Alice believes that those stresses will ultimately kill the relationship between her and Steve, as she basically debates on walking out on Steve and his obsession with the camp to return to Los Angeles. I think that most everyone assumed that this scene implied that they had fornicated the night before and that Alice was basically having second thoughts about Steve, like, ugh. Counselor Bill's introduction is minimal, which is sad since he's a likable character. The few pages that he's around anyway. And I feel like the lack of detail for him is because he was meant to be this subtle red herring for the film. Steve heads into town, leaving behind all the counselors just as a storm is descending upon the camp. Ned nervously shows off to Brenda, coming off as an overgrown man-child, and she begins to take a liking to him, but neither of them ever gets to make a move. Alice freshens up after the beach, reminiscing on agreeing to Steve that she would stay the week to finish setting up the camp. Here we get some major tea, a 1-2 punch rundown of Alice's problem back in LA.
This really isn't your cup of tea, is it? Particular reason?
Just a problem I have.
You want to leave?
I don't know, I may have to go back to California to straighten something out.
A lover named John who suffers the same malady as Steve. These men are unwilling to give up their own interests for a very willing Alice, and Alice is ready to tell them both to piss off and go her own way. It turns out Alice was dating Steve as far back as when he actually inherited the Camp Crystal Lake property from his father who had passed away. What? So I have questions. Like, how long were Alice and Steve actually dating? And how long were she and this John from LA together? Or because Alice has to actually go back to LA to straighten something out, are they still dating? Is Alice getting around? This is not typical final girl behavior. Alice vaguely recalls that a boy had tragically drowned, followed by some other violent incidents, but between Steve's dead silence and the hazy gossip from the Crystal Lake locals, she was never really able to piece together a cohesive story. While prepping dinner, they end up getting a surprise visit from Crystal Lake's Officer Dorff, who's looking for Crazy Ralph, hoping to pick him up and keep him from spreading his gossip about Camp Blood and stirring up trouble. Dorff's moment of character context pops up here, as it's pretty evident, much like the film, that he's trying to walk pretty tall with his big shiny motorcycle and a badge of justice, basically coming off as if he wants to go shoot cowboys and chase down stagecoaches. Oddly, all of this was very quickly prefaced back in Chapter 1 before we even met Annie Phillips. It kind of felt like the author couldn't find any place whatsoever with which to be able to jam this character's introduction. The counselors all wander off in different directions, and Ned's seen stalking Jack and Marcy from the beach and kind of beating himself up for not making a move on Brenda. He spots a figure at his cabin, believing it to be Crazy Ralph, but winds up with a happy face from the flash of a hunting knife. Jack and Marcy share a tender moment, and Marcy recalls an ominous nightmare about a bloody rainstorm just before settling down for bunk bed sexy time in the cabin that Jack happens to be sharing with Ned. Meanwhile, back in the main cabin, Alice, Bill, and Brenda are settling down for some drinks and strip Monopoly in order to keep things interesting during the dark and stormy night. Marcy makes a post-coitus bathroom break, leaving Jack behind to essentially get stoned and ponder the paranoias of relationships and sex and marriage and pregnancy, all of which are things that are generally left out of horror films. Jack's thoughts are interrupted when he's pinned down from underneath the bed and skewered right through the throat with an arrow. While using the lavatory, Marcy's hilarious philosophy on toilet graffiti, combined with the glow of a long overdue consummation with Jack, has her feeling pretty good. But not good enough to withstand a hatchet to the face while investigating a noise in the showers. The book offers a spooky perspective from Marcy as she processes the unseen killer's face as twisted into a horrifying grimace, a look of sheer, terrifying insanity, eyes wide and bulging, lips twisted into a snarl. That's literally every Disney animated villain. The remaining counselors continue to lose their clothes to mortgage payments when the storm kicks open the cabin door, reminding Brenda to shut her own cabin windows. There's a moment here that's responsible for causing serious fan speculation regarding Brenda's sexuality in the film.
Just when it was getting interesting.
Throughout the book, Brenda is pretty likable and easygoing, like she comes off as the strong, responsible type whenever necessary. She gives off tomboy vibes when she goes to help the boys with the old emergency generator, while Marcy and Alice hung back in the kitchen. I never vibed that the film was trying to pair Ned with Brenda. I had no idea, because I had always assumed that Brenda was a lesbian and that whatever was going on between her and Ned was simply a budding friendship. But when movie Brenda gets up to leave from their game of strip Monopoly, she looks down at Alice and says,
"Just when it was getting interesting."
That kind of sealed the deal for me. However, the book has Brenda speaking the line indirectly as she's putting on her raincoat, leaving the context ambiguous, which is totally fine. Meanwhile, Steve is waiting out the storm in town, pondering his detrimental path to happiness over whether or not he could just let go of the Camp Crystal Lake property, which has brought legendary shame to the Christie name, no thanks to the previous violent mysteries that went completely unsolved. Steve's economical sense to build up the camp and sell it for a high value will ultimately be his undoing. Brenda's back in her cabin with a good book when she hears what sounds like the cries of a small child out in the storm. Naturally, she goes out to look for the so-called child in the dark rain and instead winds up gored to death with multiple arrows at the archery range. Alice and Bill quickly realize how alone they appear to be and set off to find the others. In one of the few fleeting moments of sharp smarts, final girl Alice says,
Why don't we just hike out of here? Just get out, right now.
Sydney from Scream would be so proud. Steve's Jeep has gotten stuck in the mud, and Sergeant Tierney, another of Crystal Lake's finest, happens to be driving by and offers him a lift back to the camp. The pages leading up to Steve's death really make you sympathize for him because you surely thought that Steve could have been the killer in the film, given that he was away for most of the counselor kills. But in retrospect with the book, Steve was stressed out and had a lot going on that he was uncertain about, including his future with Alice. Just as he reaches the camp property, he recognizes a flashlit figure that's standing at the darkened entryway to the camp, and, while being violently gutted to death right there on the spot, he finally has the revelation that his family was actually not responsible for the curse on Camp Crystal Lake. Bill decides to check on the generator and puts a very nervous Alice down to sleep on the couch. It's at this point in the book that the reader can write off Bill as the killer, given his stream of consciousness while looking over the generator. Bill learned a lot from the Camp Crystal Lake locals in the days leading up to his job at Camp Crystal Lake. He was a hired hand at multiple other camps that contained their own legend, and therefore dismissed Camp Crystal Lake's legend as just a legend. Alice wakes up from her nap and goes looking for Bill, only to find his mutilated body and a heightened sense of being the only one alive. You can feel the tension of Alice's freak out a bit better through the book. However, there's something unintentionally hilarious about the film version, like watching Alice throw literally everything against a cabin door that swung outward. Alice then sees vehicle headlights approaching and tears down her barricade to rush out and greet Steve, only it's not Steve, it's Mrs. Voorhees, an old friend of the Christies. There's something a little weird about her calm dismissal to a very distressed Alice. Mrs. Voorhees launches into her iconic fractious monologue. It's her dead son Jason's birthday, and he went swimming with the fishes on the day that love-making counselors weren't paying any attention. Alice escapes Mrs. Voorhees' scary monologue, but efforts are stalled when she catches up to Alice and slaps her around for a bit. We eventually reach the fight on the beach, which is a blow-by-blow directly from the film, all the way down to Alice beheading Mrs. Voorhees and hopping into a canoe on the lake to detox from it all. The next morning feels like salvation until she's pulled underwater by zombie Jason in the story's chair jumper sequence that works much better on film. I believe I read or saw somewhere that Claudette's throat was to be slashed for the film. In the book, the killer just stabs her many times. In an imagined alternate sequence, I think that it would have been cool to cut to black just as she was being stabbed, and we continue to hear the audio overlay of her repeatedly being stabbed as the credits rolled. The opening sequence where the POV killer, that we later find out is actually Mrs. Voorhees, quietly walks through the cabin of sleeping kids was left out of the book and really could have used prose and context. The book began with a swift establishment of the camp's fun and carefree setting, and onward to take care of our horror trope setters, Barry and Claudette. Was the killer searching for someone or something, or was the killer protecting the children perhaps? Curtis Richards, author of the Halloween 1978 film novelization, masterfully put the reader inside the head of Michael Myers, giving a rare perspective of the uncontrolled hatred he felt and the violent executions that only gave him temporary relief. Given we don't have the iconic sounds of the killer present, I would have loved to have read Mrs. Voorhees' perspective throughout the book. I can see the risk of giving away some semblance of identity and motive. However, if Hawke had provided a vague narrative about the killer's feelings on the sleeping kids or the counselors, while withholding the fact that she is a mourning, vengeful mother, the author could have teased us a little bit more. I can say with confidence between the film and the book, we never truly identify the individuals responsible for Jason's drowning. All counselors who set foot on the grounds of Camp Crystal Lake are immediately guilty and punishable by death. Officer Dorff's minimalist introduction in Chapter 1 seemed a little forced, since we only have one goofy scene with him much later in the film, and this portion of the book was apparently the best place to introduce him in the story. There was no further expansion with Officer Dorff beyond that one scene at the camp. After her introduction to Crazy Ralph, the film shows Annie looking out of Ennis's truck window at Ralph as he hops on his old bicycle, giving her one glass glare before hopping on his bike to wheel away like Miss Gulch out of Wizard of Oz. Omitted from the book, I feel like this missing flirtback would have allowed for an additional moment for Ralph and Annie to be written out further interesting details, particularly Ralph's own thoughts as he glared at her. How much does he know about Crystal Lake, and what's his connection with any of the previous crimes that occurred? A flashback to a drunken conversation between Ned and Jack adds an emotional layer to Jack and Marcy's relationship that contrasts the standard sex equals death horror trope. I was pleasantly surprised to learn just how much of a gentleman Jack was towards Marcy about sex and love. I'm sure the entire narrative was cut from the film to remind audiences that sex equals death. No exception. The film did a great job showcasing the intense scene with Brenda being tricked into running around the rainy dark woods with nothing but a nightie only to die off screen. The book's version of that sequence stepped up that tension with a violent kill scene involving Brenda being hit with a few arrows, knocking down the archery target as she fell, and continuing to be hit with the arrows as she died. I had to take a moment to call out the need for this scene to be better experienced through the film. You can't tell whether or not you're in killer POV while watching Bill tinker with the generator, and that jump cut edit to Alice screaming Bill's name as she wakes up is so much more effective. There's also that intensely slow shot tightening in on the face of an increasingly worried Alice while she nervously brews coffee. When Alice searches for Bill and finds him mutilated and pinned with arrows to a cabin door, the whole moment is punctuated with moody ferocity by Harry Manfredini's music. I found the battle between Alice and Mrs. Voorhees to be a bit of a page-turner. It felt like I was experiencing the story all over again despite seeing the film 100 times. I think a part of it was because I knew what was going to happen, but also because it was so fun reading the psychotically puritanical thoughts of Mrs. Voorhees as she was hunting Alice. I love the bare-bones exposition given about the Christie family-owned camp and how they resourcefully kept it going on its no-frills budget. I like what brief nuggets we get about the Christies, which makes me crave an expanded backstory. Give me a limited series show. I want to see Pamela's story fleshed out similar to A&E's Base Motel story. Just imagine Mrs. Voorhees and the fall of the Christie's family camp thanks to the shenanigans of 1957 and 58, and then we time jump to the 1980s as an older Pamela wreaks havoc on the last of the Christie family before killing him and all of his counselors. I give this book a score of 8 out of 10. I love the book. I think that Simon Hawke did a great job cramming this classic into roughly 190 pages. The character developments and tension leading up to each death was certainly superior in written form. But the book felt like an alternate take on the film, which technically came first. The film dials down on all of the common sense and awareness so that the audience can focus on the brutal and unsuspecting whittling down of counselors and believing in Alice as the final girl. My only wish is that we could have gotten a little bit more of Mrs. Voorhees from that unidentified killer's perspective, building up to the big reveal, in which that I would have enjoyed putting those pieces together myself. I didn't care for the poor handling of Officer Dorff's character, as it was just simply too short and kind of out of place, and it just never amounted to anything. The book fascinated me the most with Alice and Steve's characters, as they were just a little bit more aware of the camp's legacy and really had the power to be smarter characters. On an interesting side note, the film shows Steve reaching up to caress Alice's face during the last night's discussion, whereas the book does not. Either this simple gesture was used to compound the last night's story in the screenplay, or Simon Hawke created the backstory for Steve and Alice from that one gesture. The knowledge Alice, Steve, and Bill had of the camp's legacy merely adds to the tragedy, since they could have prevented the killing spree. But then we wouldn't have such a fun horror franchise to talk about, right? So what do you think? Have you read Friday the 13th? Do you own a copy of it? If so, how much did you throw down for it? Thanks for watching, and give me a like, and make sure to check out my other movie tie-in Massacre reviews. Lots of love, and later, nerds!
The library is now closed. Please proceed to checkout with your materials. Thank you.